Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today, we're going to be looking into the world of fitness trainers and kind of what it takes to be successful in that industry. You actually shared a fascinating article with me that has a whole bunch of interview questions for aspiring fitness trainers. And it really is a deep dive into what goes into this profession. I think this is going to be really great for our audience.
Yeah, I think so too. You know what really stood out to me about this article from Interview Prep was that, it was published back in May of 2023, so it's relatively recent. But they really do emphasize not just like the fitness knowledge. It's not all about knowing the right exercises or, the right routines, but it really highlights those soft skills, being able to work with people and really be dedicated to your client's success. I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our listeners out there, this is going to be relevant whether you are thinking about maybe becoming a fitness trainer yourself, or maybe you're working with a trainer and you want to kind of understand, the questions they might have had to answer, the training they might have gone through to get to where they are, or even if you're just somebody who's interested in fitness and, enjoys working out. I think this is going to be super interesting for just about everyone.
Yeah, for sure.
So, okay, let's jump right into it. I think one of the first things that the article talked about was, credentials and expertise.
Yeah, and right off the bat, they actually emphasize the importance of certifications.
Hmm.
And they actually give a couple of really good examples, like, the NASM CPT, so that's the National Academy of Sports Medicine Certified Personal Trainer, or, something like the FMS Level 1, which focuses on functional movement screening.
So it's really about going beyond just, I go to the gym all the time and I know what I'm doing. It's about really getting that baseline of, I have the knowledge that's recognized in the industry to actually help people.
Right, exactly. It's that sort of like uh, third-party validation that you've gone through the proper channels to learn how to do this safely and effectively.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And it's not just about getting that initial certification. I think it's an ongoing process too,
Oh,
right?
for sure. And the article actually talks about that as well.
Mm.
Fitness is a field that's constantly evolving. New research is coming out.
Yeah.
Best practices are changing. They actually, in the example answers, mention that, it's really important to stay up to date. Like subscribe to journals,
Mm.
like the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research,
Hmm.
or Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise.
Oh, wow. So like really, really hardcore academic journals.
Right. And they also talk about going to conferences. Things put on by the, NSCA or ACSM, so National Strength and Conditioning Association, the American College of Sports Medicine. It's
Yeah.
all about that continuing education.
Yeah, I really like that. So it's not just a one and done. It's you get certified, but then you're constantly learning, you're constantly growing, you're constantly staying up to date. It's almost like doctors have to.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so that's all about, the trainer themselves and the credentials. But what about actually interacting with their clients?
Yeah, that's really where, the rubber hits the road. And the article highlights that working with diverse clients is really important. Not everyone is coming in with the same goals or the same background. So they actually talk about things like, the differences between training, let's say, athletes versus individuals who are looking to lose weight, or even seniors who are maybe looking to, be more mobile and improve their balance.
Right. So you can't just have like a cookie cutter routine for everyone.
No, not at all. You really have to individualize it and understand, what are their needs, what are their objectives, what are their limitations, what are their, medical histories even.
Right. Like if you're working with somebody who has an injury, obviously you're not going to have them doing the same things as somebody who's perfectly healthy.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So that kind of brings us then to actually designing those personalized workout plans.
Hmm.
And they have a really cool example in the article about a client with a sedentary job who is looking to, lose weight, get healthier. And it's really fascinating how they break it down. It's not just about, you know, go run on the treadmill for an hour. It's like combining different types of exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah, that example was really interesting. And they talk about, combining cardio and strength training, making sure that you're incorporating flexibility as well. It's not just about, lifting heavy weights or running for miles. It's that balance. And they actually mention, making sure that the program incorporates compound movements. So things like squats, lunges, push-ups, rows, really hitting all the major muscle groups.
Yeah. So you're working smart, not just hard.
Exactly. And they talk about HIAT as well, high intensity interval training, which can be really effective for both, calorie burning and improving your cardiovascular fitness.
Yeah, that's one of the things that, I've noticed is really popular these days. But then it's not just about the exercises themselves, it's about how you structure the workout, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the example answer really goes into detail about that. They talk about, dynamic warm-ups. So you're not just jumping right into the workout, you're preparing your body.
Yeah, you got to get the blood flowing.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And then they talk about exercise variations. So you're not doing the same thing every single time. You're keeping your body guessing.
Keeps it interesting.
Right. Keeps it interesting,
Yeah.
prevents plateaus. And then, of course, cool downs,
Hmm.
stretching, and
Yeah.
making sure that you're not just, stopping abruptly and, risking injury or soreness.
Yeah, because sometimes those cool downs and stretches are the hardest part. You just want to be done.
Right. But they're so important. And I think the other thing that they mentioned that I thought was really, really smart was the emphasis on setting those short-term achievable milestones.
You got to break it down, right? Like those little victories along the way.
Exactly. Because, if you're just focused on this, big long-term goal, it can seem really daunting.
Hmm.
But if you're hitting those little milestones along the way, it's like, okay, I can do this.
You get that little dopamine rush. You're ready to keep going.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I love it. Okay, so that's, the plan itself. But before you even get to that, you got to understand what your client's starting point is, what their goals are, what their limitations might be. They actually talk about the whole assessment process, which I think is super interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like detective work in a way. And the article breaks it down into two key parts. So there's that initial consultation, really sitting down with the client, getting to know them. What's your exercise history? Have you ever worked with a trainer before? What are you hoping to achieve? Do you have any medical conditions that we need to be aware of?
Right. So getting that full picture of who this person is.
Exactly. And then based on that, they talk about doing a physical assessment. So this is where you actually get some, objective data. Things like body composition, how much muscle mass do you have, how much body fat, cardiovascular endurance, how's your heart health?
So you're not just like looking at them and eyeballing it. You're
Yeah.
actually getting some numbers.
Right. Strength, how strong are they? Flexibility, what's their range of motion like? And even posture,
Mhm.
how are they carrying themselves? All of that gives you a really good starting point to then start to craft that program.
That's amazing. So, okay, so we've got our credentials, we've got our assessment, we've got our plan. What about when, you're working with a client and they hit a wall, like they hit that plateau where they're not seeing progress anymore? What do you do then?
Well, that's a really common challenge that a lot of people face. And the article actually emphasizes that the first step is to reassess. It's time to revisit those goals. Are they still relevant? Has the client's life changed in any way that we need to adjust for? And then really take a close look at the program itself. Is it time to change things up? And then even beyond that, you actually talk about, having open communication about lifestyle factors.
Like sleep and nutrition, that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, you can be doing everything right in the gym, but if you're not sleeping well, if you're not eating well, that's going to impact your result.
Yeah, it's all connected, right?
It's all connected.
Yeah.
And then based on that reassessment, you start to get creative. Maybe you introduce some different types of exercises. Maybe you adjust the intensity or the volume of the workout. Maybe you incorporate new training techniques that, challenge the body in different ways. And then, of course, always emphasizing the importance of nutrition and recovery.
Yeah, so it's like a whole holistic approach, not just about the hour that they're in the gym with you.
Exactly. Exactly.
I love that. Okay, so, we've got that. Now, what about the part that always makes me nervous at the gym, which is making sure people are doing exercises safely and correctly? Like, what happens if somebody's, lifting too much weight or doing something with bad form?
Yeah, that's a huge responsibility as a trainer.
Mm.
Safety is paramount.
Mm.
And the article stresses that, you need to be really good at demonstrating proper form.
Hmm.
Show the client exactly how to do it before they even attempt it. And then it's about being really observant, providing that real-time feedback.
Yeah.
If you see them starting to, deviate from the correct form, you need to correct it right away.
Because otherwise they could get hurt, right?
Exactly. They could get hurt. They could develop bad habits that are hard to break later on. And they actually talk about, hands-on adjustments, of course, with the client's permission. But sometimes, you can actually physically guide them into the right position, help them feel what it should feel like, and then, always emphasizing the importance of those warm-ups and cool-downs to prepare the body and prevent injury.
Yeah, so it's like a constant vigilance. You're not just like chatting with your buddy while they're over there, potentially hurting themselves.
Exactly. You always have to have your eyes on them, make sure they're doing things correctly.
Yeah, that's really important. Okay, so that's the safety part. Now let's talk about motivation, because I think a lot of people struggle with that, staying motivated, staying engaged, especially when things get tough or, you're not seeing results right away. How do trainers help people with that?
Yeah, that's the art of coaching, right?
Yeah.
And the article highlights a few really important things. First of all, that personalization. If the workout is something that the client enjoys, if it's something that's tailored to their interests, they're going to be more likely to stick with it.
Right. So not just giving everybody the same routine.
Exactly. And then variety. You've got to keep things interesting. If you're doing the same thing every day, you're going to get bored.
Mm.
So mixing things up, introducing new exercises, that's really important.
Yeah, like those group fitness classes where they have all the crazy equipment.
Right. And then, never underestimate the power of positive reinforcement. Acknowledging their efforts, celebrating their milestones, no matter how small. Giving them that encouragement, that can go a long way.
Yeah, those little wins, right? Like even if it's just, they lifted 5 pounds more than they did last week.
Exactly. Celebrate it.
Celebrate.
Yeah, it all adds up.
It all adds up, yeah. But what about when you're working with a client who's maybe being a little difficult, like they're resisting the program or they're not really cooperating? How do you handle that?
Yeah, those are tough situations. And I think the key there is communication and building trust. You're not going to get anywhere if you're just, barking orders at them.
Yeah, you're not a drill sergeant.
Right. So the article talks about, actively listening, really hearing their concerns, understanding where they're coming from, validating their feelings,
Oh.
and then explaining, the why behind the program. This is why we're doing this. This is what we're hoping to achieve. And sometimes even sharing success stories from other clients, people who maybe had similar challenges or were resistant at first, but then saw amazing results. That can be really powerful.
Yeah, you're like, look, I know you're struggling with this, but look at, Sally. She was doing the same thing, and now she's, running marathons.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Wow, that's awesome. Okay, so that's, working one-on-one with clients. But a lot of trainers also work with groups. What are some of the skills that are needed for success in that kind of environment?
Yeah. Group fitness is a whole different ballgame. And the article does a good job of highlighting that. First of all, you're managing a lot more people, right? And everyone's going to be at a different level. They're going to have different needs. They're going to have different abilities. So being able to manage that, keep everyone engaged, keep everyone motivated, that's really important. And then, being able to adapt your instruction. Not everyone's going to be able to do every exercise the same way.
Right. So you're like, okay, if you can't do a burpee, do this instead.
Exactly. Modifications, progressions, regressions, all of that.
So you're like thinking on your feet the whole time. You have to be. And then, the energy level.
Yeah.
You've got to be enthusiastic. You've got to be motivating. You've got to, keep the energy up for everyone. It's not just about you. It's about the whole group.
Yeah. You got to be like a performer almost.
You do. You absolutely do.
So you've got your cardio, you've got your strength training. But what about flexibility and mobility? Because I think sometimes that gets overlooked.
Yeah, and the article actually emphasizes that, it's really important to incorporate those elements into a well-rounded program. And they talk about, starting with a dynamic warm-up. So those are movements that, get your heart rate up, get your blood flowing, and really get those joints moving through their full range of motion. And then they talk about different types of stretching. So there's static stretching, which is kind of what we traditionally think of, holding a stretch. There's PNF stretching, proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. That's a little more advanced. It involves contracting and relaxing the muscles.
So that's like when you have a partner, right? And they're like pushing on your leg and you're resisting.
Exactly. And then they talk about myofascial release, which is using things like foam rollers or lacrosse balls to really get into those tight spots, those knots in the muscles.
Oh, yeah. That hurts so good.
It does. It does. But it can be really beneficial. And the whole point is to improve your overall mobility, prevent injury, and just feel better in your body.
Yeah. I feel like that's something I need to do more of, honestly.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do. It's easy to overlook.
Okay, so that's flexibility and mobility. Now, we can't talk about fitness without talking about nutrition, right?
Right.
Because you can't outrun a bad diet.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And the article actually points out that a comprehensive fitness plan should include some nutritional guidance. It's not just about the exercise. It's about fueling your body properly.
Yeah, you can't just eat pizza and burgers all day and expect to see results.
Right. So they talk about things like, assessing the client's current eating habits. What are they eating now? What are their, macronutrient ratios like? So that's protein, carbohydrates, and fats.
So it's like personalized nutrition advice.
It is. And then based on their goals, are they trying to lose weight? Are they trying to build muscle? Are they trying to improve their athletic performance? You tailor those recommendations accordingly.
So it's really like a whole lifestyle change, not just about the exercise.
It really is. It's about, making healthy choices, making sustainable changes that they can stick with long term.
Yeah, because that's the thing. It's not just about, a quick fix. It's about making changes that will last a lifetime.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's nutrition. Now, the article also talks about working with specific populations, and they give the example of older adults, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, and that's where that specialization comes in, right?
Yeah.
Because, you wouldn't necessarily train a 70-year-old the same way you would train a 20-year-old. So the article highlights, things like age-related muscle loss. As we get older, we naturally lose muscle mass. So that's something to be aware of. Potential joint issues. A lot of older adults have arthritis or other joint problems.
So you got to be careful.
You got to be careful. And then balance and stability become even more important as we get older, to prevent falls and things like that. So the article actually mentions that a lot of trainers who specialize in working with older adults will get additional certifications, things like a senior fitness specialist or a functional aging specialist.
That's really dedicated to that population.
They are. And they focus on exercises that, improve those functional movements, the things that you need to do every day, getting up and down from a chair, carrying groceries, things like that. And then, of course, strength, flexibility, balance, all of that is important to maintain independence and quality of life as we age.
Yeah, I think that's so important because, you don't want to stop moving just because you're getting older.
No, absolutely not. Staying active is one of the best things you can do for your health at any age.
Okay, so, we've talked about all these different aspects of training, but how do you actually track progress? How do you know if what you're doing is working?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the article talks about a couple of different methods. So first of all, they talk about taking baseline measurements. So that's at the very beginning. You measure things like body composition, strength, flexibility, and then you do regular reassessments. So maybe every 4 to 6 weeks, you check in, you see how things are progressing. Are they getting stronger? Are they losing body fat? Are they improving their flexibility?
So you're not just like, how do you feel? You're actually looking at the numbers.
Exactly. But then they also talk about the importance of those subjective measures.
Yeah.
How is the client feeling? What are their energy levels like? Are they noticing any changes in their body? It's not just about the numbers, it's about how they're feeling as well.
Yeah, that's really important. Like if they're feeling more energetic or they're sleeping better or their clothes fit better, those are all really important signs of progress.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the workouts themselves, but what about rest and recovery? Because I feel like sometimes that gets overlooked.
Yeah. And that's a mistake because rest is just as important as the workout itself. That's when your body repairs, rebuilds, gets stronger. So the article actually emphasizes the importance of incorporating rest days into the training schedule. You don't have to work out every single day. In fact, you shouldn't.
And rest doesn't mean just sitting on the couch, right?
No, not necessarily. They talk about active rest. Maybe it's a day where you go for a walk, you do some light stretching, you do some yoga. It's about moving your body, but not pushing it too hard.
So you're still getting those benefits of movement without, stressing your body too much.
Exactly. And then, of course, nutrition, hydration, sleep, all of those things are crucial for recovery as well. You got to fuel your body properly. You got to stay hydrated, and you've got to get enough sleep.
Yeah, sleep is so important. I feel like that's the one I always skimp on.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do. But it's so crucial for, muscle repair, hormone regulation, all of that.
Okay, so now let's talk about technology because, the fitness world has really embraced technology these days. You've got fitness apps, you've got wearables, you've got all this stuff. How are trainers using that to benefit their clients?
Yeah, technology can be a really powerful tool when used correctly. So the article talks about things like, fitness apps that can help clients track their progress, set goals, stay accountable, and then wearables, things like heart rate monitors, smartwatches.
Yeah, I love my Fitbit.
Yeah, those can provide really valuable data during workouts. You can see your heart rate, you can see how many calories you're burning, you can see how many steps you're taking. And that can be really motivating for some people.
Yeah, it's like gamifying fitness almost.
It is.
Yeah.
And it can also help the trainer tailor the workouts, make sure that the client is working at the right intensity level.
Yeah. So it's not just about, I think you're working hard enough. It's like, no, your heart rate is actually in the zone that we want it to be in.
Exactly. Exactly.
I love that. Okay, so now let's talk about the real world because life happens, right? You have cancellations, you have scheduling conflicts. How do trainers handle that kind of stuff?
Yeah, you got to be flexible. You got to be understanding. Things come up. So the article talks about, encouraging clients to give as much notice as possible if they need to cancel or reschedule.
But sometimes things happen, right? Like your kid gets sick or you get called into work.
Right. And that's where that flexibility comes in. Maybe you can reschedule a session. Maybe you can offer a virtual session. There are options. And then if a session does get canceled, the trainer can use that time to, catch up on other work, program design for other clients, administrative tasks, things like that.
So they're still being productive.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about communication outside of the actual training sessions? Because, you might have questions for your trainer or you might need to check in with them about something.
Yeah. And the article actually talks about the importance of having those channels of communication open.
Yeah.
So things like email, messaging apps, those are really popular these days. You can send a quick message, you can get a quick response.
Yeah, it's so much easier than, having to call and leave a voicemail and wait for them to call you back.
Exactly. But they also emphasize that it's important to adapt to the client's preferences. Some people might prefer a phone call, some people might prefer text messages, some people might prefer email. It's about finding what works best for them.
So it's about that personalization again?
It is. It's all about, making sure that the client feels comfortable, feels supported.
Yeah, like they can reach out to you anytime.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so now, not everybody's perfectly healthy. Some people have injuries, some people have limitations. How do trainers work with clients who might have those challenges?
Yeah, that's where that assessment process is so important, right? Because you need to know what those limitations are. You need to know what those injuries are. So the article talks about, starting with a really thorough discussion of their medical history, any injuries they have, any pain they're experiencing, any limitations in their movement. And then based on that, you modify the exercises. You might choose low-impact exercises that are easier on the joints.
Right, so like instead of running, maybe they're swimming or doing the elliptical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or maybe you modify the exercise itself. Maybe instead of doing a full squat, they're doing a chair squat. And then, really focusing on strengthening the muscles that support those injured areas.
So it's like rehab almost.
It can be, yeah. And then, constant communication is key. How are you feeling? Is this too much? Do we need to back off? Really making sure that they're comfortable and they're not pushing themselves too hard.
Yeah, because the last thing you want is to make an injury worse.
Exactly.
Okay, so now, life throws curveballs, right? What happens if, you're in the middle of a workout and something unexpected happens? Like the article gives the example of having to adapt an outdoor workout because the park was closed.
Yeah, I love that example because it shows how adaptable you have to be as a trainer. You can't always control the environment. So in that scenario, the trainer had to think on their feet. They had to assess the situation. They had to look around, see what was available. And then they use things like park benches, the surrounding environment to create a workout.
So it's like that whole, use what you've got kind of mentality.
Exactly. You don't need fancy equipment to get a good workout. You just need to be creative.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so hopefully, nothing too serious ever happens, but emergencies do happen. Like the article talks about a client who started feeling dizzy and short of breath. What do you do in that situation?
Well, first and foremost, safety comes first. So the article is really clear. You stop the exercise immediately. Have the client sit down, have them lie down if necessary. And then you assess the situation. What are their symptoms? Do they have any medical conditions that we need to be aware of?
Like if they have asthma or something like that?
Exactly. Offer them water if they're able to drink. Have them take slow, deep breaths. And, depending on the severity of the situation, you might need to call 911.
Yeah, so it's like you're a first responder almost.
You are in that moment. You have to be.
Wow, that's a lot of responsibility.
It is. It is.
Okay, so, a lot of trainers work in gyms. So what are some of the other responsibilities they might have beyond just training clients?
Yeah, it can be a pretty multifaceted role. So the article talks about things like, leading group fitness classes. A lot of trainers do both one-on-one training and group fitness.
Mm.
Developing those personalized workout plans, not just for their individual clients, but maybe for the gym members in general.
Oh, so it's like creating programs for, people who aren't necessarily working with them directly.
Exactly. And then, the less glamorous stuff like making sure the equipment is clean, making sure it's functioning properly, making sure it's safe.
Oh, yeah, nobody wants to use a sweaty machine.
Mm, No, nobody does. And then, collaborating with other staff members, maybe organizing events, workshops, things like that. It's really about being a part of the gym community.
So it's like you're wearing a lot of different hats.
You really are.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different skills and knowledge and responsibilities, but what about the trainer's own personal fitness? Like, do they need to be, super fit themselves?
I think it definitely helps. They say, be the change you want to see in the world, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a trainer who's, out of shape, eating junk food all the time, it's going to be hard to motivate your clients to make healthy choices.
Yeah, like do as I say, not as I do doesn't really work.
Exactly. So the article emphasizes that, it's really important for trainers to practice what they preach. They should have a balanced workout routine themselves. They should be eating healthy. They should be getting enough sleep. They should be managing their stress. They should be living a healthy lifestyle. And that's not just because it's good for them, but it also sets a good example for their clients.
Yeah, it's like, I'm not just telling you to do this, I'm doing it too. We're in this together.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so the last question in the article, which I think is a really good one, is why do you believe you would make an excellent addition to our team? Like if you were interviewing for a fitness trainer position, how would you answer that?
Yeah, that's the time to really sell yourself right. But based on everything we've talked about today, I think the best answers would highlight those key qualities that we've been discussing. That passion for helping people. You genuinely care about helping your clients achieve their goals. That commitment to continuous learning. You're always staying up to date on the latest research. You're always looking for ways to improve your skills.
So you're not just like, I got my certification, I'm done.
Exactly. And then, that relevant background and experience. What have you done that's prepared you for this role?
Right, like if you've worked with different populations or you have specialized certifications.
Exactly. And then those strong interpersonal skills.
Mm.
Can you build rapport with people? Can you motivate them? Can you support them? All those things are really important. And then, being a team player. Are you going to be a positive addition to the gym environment? Are you going to be somebody who's, collaborative and supportive?
Yeah, so it's really about the whole package, not just about, how much you can bench press.
Exactly. Exactly. It's about the whole person.
Wow. So I feel like we've really gone in depth on this today, and I think it's really eye-opening to see just how much goes into being a successful fitness trainer. It's so much more than just, knowing how to lift weights or run on a treadmill.
It really is. It's a complex and rewarding profession. And, I think what really stands out to me is that client-centered approach. It's all about, understanding your clients, meeting them where they are, and helping them achieve their goals.
Yeah, and it's
So,
constantly evolving, right? Like the fitness industry is always changing, new research is coming out, new trends are emerging. So you got to be able to adapt.
absolutely, you got to be a lifelong learner.
So it really makes you think, what are some other professions out there that require that same level of, constant learning, constant adaptation, that ability to work with people, that dedication to, helping others?
That's a great question. I think we could probably do a whole other deep dive on that.
Yeah, like maybe next time we could look at, education or healthcare or technology. Those are all fields that are constantly changing. Expert speaker.